Leaders from the group of 7 nations vow to work together to improve global access to COVID-19 vaccines. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. In a virtual meeting hosted by the United Kingdom, G7 leaders addressed the need to distribute vaccines to billions of people in developing countries. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson pledging to donate the UK's surplus, while U.S. President Joe Biden announcing a $4 billion commitment to the global vaccine alliance known as COVAX. The pledges come after United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres called the distribution of vaccines, quote, wildly uneven and unfair. CGTN's Nicole Johnston begins our coverage with this report from London.
In the world of virtual meetings, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson had to ask German Chancellor Angela Merkel to mute herself at their G7 meeting.
In June. Can you hear us, Angela? That's okay, that's all right. I think you need to mute.
Johnson then announced the UK will donate any surplus supplies of COVID-19 vaccine to the rest of the world.
Around the world, make sure everybody gets the vaccines that they need so that the whole world can come through this pandemic together.
Chancellor Merkel agreed with the British Prime Minister.
Everyone has to have a part, so it's important to get vaccines for COVAX quickly. Or we make a contribution from the vaccines already promised to us and give some of them away.
COVAX is the international organisation set up to make sure low-income countries also receive doses of the vaccine. The first announcement on which countries will get how much is expected within a week. French President Emmanuel Macron says Europe should donate 5% of its vaccine to Africa. The G7 meets as the issue of vaccine nationalism heats up. The UN says 10 countries have administered 75% of all the world's COVID-19 vaccinations so far.
If some countries prefer to give their donations to certain countries because they are their neighbors or because they have some relationship, what we can do is, if this comes through the COVAX, the earmarked donation can go to those countries, then the COVAX stock could go to other countries. So we can strike a balance.
It's an almost impossible balance to strike. Vaccinating your own population first, while making sure the rest of the world doesn't get left behind. Nicole Johnston, CGTN, London.
For more on the G7 meeting, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Victor Gao. He's a chair professor at Soochow University. From Washington, D.C., Nicolas Veron is a senior fellow with Bruegel and the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Also in Washington, D.C., Harlan Ullman is the chairman of the Killowen Group and a senior advisor of the Atlantic Council. And from North Carolina, Klaus Larres is a distinguished professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Klaus, we'll start with you. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson with this appeal. Talk to us about why this is so essential.
It is very essential because, as your report rightly said, so far only the rich countries are looking after themselves and the poor countries really are left without any vaccine at all. 30% of the entire world hasn't received any vaccine at all. And that is, I think, 130 countries, something like that. They haven't had any vaccine at all. That is very sad. Essentially, President Macron's idea of immediately giving 5% of the rich countries' vaccine supply to Africa, for example, is a very good idea. But of course, domestic public opinion and nationalism in the various wealthy countries around the world will probably prevent that. At the moment, they're just throwing money at it. And of course, that's a good idea to dedicate more money to the production of vaccines. But at the moment, that is not enough because production takes its time, a few weeks, a few months until the vaccines are actually made available. So the 5% which Macron suggests is a good idea because they could be immediately delivered to, for example, Africa but I can't see that that will actually happen.
Nicolas, let me ask you about this Macron proposal that Klaus was just talking about. You've got vaccines just rolling out in a number of these countries. So, Nicolas, what do you really expect realistically when it comes to this sort of thing? As Klaus was saying, you've got nationalism at play, got a lot of people clamoring for the vaccines in these countries. This may not sit well with some of them.
Well, obviously, 5% of the numbers for rich countries going to poor countries is not enough by a very wide margin, because there are many more people out there in Africa and other places, poor places of the world, who need the vaccine. That said, as the previous speaker said, it's much better than nothing, and it can actually make a big difference, because if those 5% are directed at the priority publics, especially people who are on the front lines, in hospitals, in care homes, etc., then it can have a much bigger effect than the relatively small number suggests. So it's only the beginning, but I think what we get from this G7 is especially a hopeful message that there is international cooperation, especially from the US, and that's to say the obvious, a big contrast to the previous period, that the US is out there willing to work with allies and like-minded countries to do something positive for the world. And just that, I think, is a message of hope these days.
Harlan, to that point, let's talk a little bit about the United States. I was speaking to someone today. They've got parents that are in their 80s. They've already had COVID-19. They survived. They're terrified they're going to get it again. They're still waiting for their vaccine. We're seeing kind of a slow rollout in a number of states, number of areas. Then we have this massive storm this week, which is going to disrupt things even further. And I look at some of these richer nations, it's not just the United States, having trouble with the rollout. What does that mean in terms of, if you extend that further to these developing countries, how difficult is it going to be to achieve this goal?
There are several really critical points. I think one of the most important ones is that Donald Trump has now rejected, Joe Biden has now rejected Donald Trump's America First policies. He spoke to the Munich Security Conference and the G7. America is back, it's going to be engaged, and that's going to be a good thing. Second, a huge number of people don't want to accept the vaccine. In the United States, it's about a third. So if we extend this globally, which is important, you're going to have to make sure that people are willing to accept the vaccine. Third, in the United States, while America did brilliantly in developing a vaccine, it did awfully in distributing and putting shots in people's arms. And one of the greatest issues we're going to face is not so much production and dedication to vaccines to other countries, but how is this going to be done physically? A lot of the countries lack the infrastructure. And so one of the things that's going to be critical is a plan so that when these other countries do get the vaccine at some stage, which they will, that they can use it. This is a really difficult set of problems. They're going to get a lot worse before they get better. And somebody needs to take charge. And I hope the United States takes the lead with the World Health Organization to work through a lot of these issues, because until the globe is largely vaccinated, COVID is still a threat.
And Harlan, to your point, a lot of these vaccines, or some of these vaccines, need refrigeration, very specific refrigeration. In fact, that's even been a problem here in the United States. And I imagine when you extend that further, that's also an issue, isn't it?
It's going to make the whole issue of logistics is really going to be very difficult. It may well be that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine can be replicated, because apparently that does not have the same stringent requirements. But on the one hand, vaccinating everybody on the globe is very important. The logistics of doing this to deliver shots in the arms, for all the reasons you just suggested, Mike, are huge. And there needs to be a really serious group put together that can work through these logistic issues, because this disease is going to get a lot worse, in my mind, before it gets better.
Victor, China is not a participant in the G7, but they are taking part in getting some of these vaccines to a number of countries, dozens of countries, from Senegal to Hungary, Brazil to Zimbabwe. Let's listen to some comments from the Chinese Foreign Ministry.
We think all parties should come together to reject vaccine nationalism and facilitate a fair and equitable distribution of vaccines, especially among developing countries. China will continue to contribute vaccines to relevant countries and contribute to the final victory in the global fight against COVID-19.
Victor, talk to me about China's position that they've staked out on the world stage.
Well, I think the vaccine is increasingly important, and it is an important part of the overall solution of overcoming this pandemic issue right now. China has been spending a lot of money on R&D for the vaccine, production of the vaccine, and cooperation with the WHO in terms of pushing forward with this international cooperation of spreading the vaccine program to the developing countries in particular. China has also been working with quite a number of countries, including in Europe, for example, Serbia as an example, to help them to make sure that they get the vaccine. Vaccine is very, very important now. China right now is not vaccinating a lot of its people, mainly because of the low level of spread of the virus to start with in China. This actually helps China to free up a lot of its resources to help many other countries in getting the vaccine that China produces. And I hope the G7 discussions will be part of the overall international cooperation, especially led by the WHO. And all countries need to pitch in. If you have vaccine, if you have money, if you have expertise or talents, make them available to those countries in need.
You mentioned making them available. China also providing 10 million doses to COVAX. What kind of impact do you think that'll have? Victor?
I think China's cooperation with COVAX under WHO is very, very important. And China from the very beginning has committed to make the vaccines it will produce as an international public good. President Xi Jinping has emphasized this point again and again, both at home as well as in international forum. And I think the Chinese government and the companies involved are really very much committing their full resources to make this a reality. I am personally aware of lots of countries working together with Chinese authorities as well as companies producing the vaccine for cooperation. And I think other countries should also pitch in to make sure that such international cooperation will generate benefit for mankind as a whole, because mankind only has one single fight against COVID-19 pandemic, and all of us are in the same boat.
Harlan, the U.S. now pledging $4 billion to the COVAX program, $2 billion now, $2 billion over the next couple of years. Is that enough? Does that help? What kind of impact do you think that'll have?
It's on the margin. You're talking about the need for over 10 billion doses, assuming everybody needs to get 2. Look at the problems we've had administering the vaccine in the United States, which is certainly one of the most advanced countries in the world. What's needed here is really an overarching plan, whether it's through the WHO or the UN, on a country-by-country basis, so that both the logistics are put in place, production is put in place, priorities are set. I rather doubt in most developing worlds, most developing countries, that you actually have a priority list other than in very, very general terms. So the first step right now is to have each country, each nation develop its priority list about who it's going to vaccinate and start to put in place the plans, because this is going to take, my guess is, a couple of years to be able to be fully administered around the world.
Klaus, the German chancellor was asked to mute at one point, but at another point she was talking, and she said, of course, this pandemic will only be over when all the people in the world are vaccinated. Of course, she's right, of course. But you look at what's happened and you start to see this virus mutate, and we're hearing about different variants. There's the Kent variant in the UK, which quickly spread throughout the United Kingdom and has spread elsewhere. We've seen other variants coming from South Africa, Brazil. And these mutations continue to develop, making it much tougher to combat the virus. So talk to us about efforts that could really accelerate things. What can be done?
Well, that brings us back to Macron's suggestion to really give the doses which the Western world and the rich world has to the developing countries. And that is the reason why that is being done, because of the danger of mutations, of the pandemic not being coming to an end at all. But on the other hand, one also has to say that the Europeans are worried about the Chinese and Russian soft power impression they are making by giving their vaccine to the developing world. The Europeans and the United States realize very well that that enhances China's and Russia's soft power, and they don't like it. They want to compete with it. And I think in a way that is good, because if more rich countries, if more developed countries give their vaccines to the developing world, that will bring the pandemic to a much faster end. We really have to share the vaccine all around the world. We should not monopolize it in the developing world and in the countries which can afford it. And the same applies, of course, in the EU as such, because the EU decided to deal with the vaccine as at the EU level rather than at the national level, because they wanted to avoid that only the rich countries in the EU and not the small and the poor countries in the EU could afford to produce and distribute the vaccine. So that phenomenon, they showed solidarity with each other, and that phenomenon now has to be done globally and not just within the EU. And I think they all see that, but to do it actually, to implement it, that is of course a problem.
Victor, I want to get your response to what Klaus just said. These concerns about China exerting soft power. It doesn't seem to me, when you're looking at a pandemic and people needing to get jabs in their arms, that should be much of a concern, but I want to get your thoughts.
Well, I think Klaus framed it very well.
Victor?
Go ahead.
Well,
Victor.
I think at this critical moment, saving lives is the most important priority. All the countries need to do the right thing, to commit their resources to help all the countries to save lives. Soft power or hard power or smart power should come secondary to this top priority. I don't think we need to be distracted by politics or geopolitics when mankind as a whole are faced with this daunting task of saving mankind. So I would say every country, every political system, every company need to be fully mobilized to do the right thing, to produce vaccine, make available the vaccine, or provide funding for the vaccine so that developing countries, emerging economies, poorer populations can get access to vaccine. Because after all, allow me to emphasize, we only have one single fight against the pandemic, and we are completely in the same boat. So don't argue about these political things. Let's do the right thing in a scientific way, providing vaccine for everyone in the world.
And Nicolas, I think you wanted to jump in. What were you going to say?
Well, I'm sorry, Mike, I couldn't hear you well, so I thought you were calling on me, but apologies to Victor for that. I think both Victor and Klaus framed it very well. This is a one humankind fight. We're all there together, and there's a virtuous circle going on in terms of, in a way, a race to help the people and countries who need most help as soon as practical. It's obvious that every country will think of their populations first, but not absolutely so, and that's where Macron's signal is important. And more importantly, once the vaccination will have reached a critical mass in rich countries, it will not stop there. There's a shared consciousness, a shared awareness that everybody needs to be vaccinated around the world. The joint commitments to COVAX are a good indication of that, but it goes beyond. It's really that essentially all countries in the world, despite their geopolitical rivalries and concerns about soft power and influence, their interests are aligned here. So I think that's very hopeful. That said, of course, that hope should not make us complacent or overly optimistic. At this point, the virus is winning. You mentioned the mutations and the variants. So we need that alignment of incentives between all countries in the world. But I think we're in a much, much better place now than we were as recently as 3 months ago in terms of those prospects for cooperation, joining forces, winning the one fight against the virus together, as Victor Gao put it.
Nicolas, there's been some criticism of the European Union for how they've handled the procurement of the vaccines. They are late in ordering vaccines. They bet on some companies that didn't deliver. Where do things stand right now in the European Union?
Well, I think the European Union made a number of mistakes, and European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen has apologized for it. So there's a lot of learning by doing. This task of dealing with these life and death issues for the European Union, for the European Commission is entirely new. It's something they have never done before, and frankly, they have some teething troubles. That's obvious, but I think they learn from their mistakes. That was also the case in the unfortunate episode they had with the Irish border a couple of weeks ago. And I think they're learning quite quickly. So I'm optimistic that this is not an indication of things to come.
Victor, I want to talk to you a little bit about messaging coming from the Biden administration. In fact, Harlan mentioned this earlier. He spoke at the Munich Security Conference today, President Biden, and he called for the restoration of the transatlantic conference. He also had a very specific message for China. Let's listen.
You know, we must prepare together for long-term strategic competition with China. How the United States, Europe, and Asia work together to secure the peace and defend our shared values and advance our prosperity across the Pacific will be among the most consequential efforts we undertake. Competition with China is going to be stiff. That's what I expect, and that's what I welcome, because I believe in the global system Europe and the United States together with our allies in the Indo-Pacific worked so hard to build over the last 70 years. We can own the race for the future.
Victor, how is Beijing going to respond to those remarks, do you think?
Well, first of all, I think competition is normal and is natural, almost in everything that human beings will do. Therefore, if, as President Biden said, competition between China and the United States, I think let's do the competition in a noble and decent way, following the rules. And if the competitor emerges stronger, let's welcome that, and let's redouble our own effort to become a better competitor. Now, competition itself should not end up in rivalry or in antagonistic rivalry against each other, because we need to be very careful about setting up the guardrails so that relations do not get out of control. Therefore, I think China-US relations will be highly competitive in the years and decades to come. This should be normal rather than should be considered as very much alarming. And I think China welcomes competition with any other country in the world, because the more competition controlled and normal and decent there will be, as a result of that, it will be better for mankind as a whole. So China-US relations need to be very much controlled, but competition itself should be considered as normal and mutually beneficial for both China and the United States. Now, as far as setting up greater alliances with European countries or the so-called Indo-Pacific region, for example, if they do not escalate out of control, if they are built for example, greater rules and greater normalcy, for example, China will be welcoming that. China is very much part of the international community, and China is very much a participant in the international order right now. China is not breaking up all the boats, for example, setting up a new system completely at the expense of the current international system. So I hope President Biden and his team will realize what China is really up to. China is for normal living together and getting along with the United States and any other country in the world.
Nicolas, China is now the EU's largest trading partner. That happened this week, supplanting the United States. What does that say about the economic partnership with Europe?
Well, as you know, Europe and China just signed in late December a comprehensive agreement on investment, and this is not yet ratified. It will not be ratified for a year at least, so it's not yet in place. But I think it's a powerful signal from the European Union that they're not going on a trajectory of decoupling economically from China. Actually, the opposite. They're engaging with China and supporting the Chinese strategy of reform and opening up. So I think here, I would echo what Victor Gao just said. I think the word competition should be viewed as positive, and on the side of the US and of President Biden is a big de-escalation from the previous rhetoric of treating China as an adversary or an antagonist. A competitor is something much more manageable. So I think that should be welcomed for the sake of world peace. Of course, there will be competition, and that's a good thing. It can lead to a race to the top, not a race to the bottom, as we're seeing with the effort to help poor countries with vaccines. So that is a very hopeful signal, I think, and the EU views it as such as well.
Harlan, do you see it that way as well?
I think that this discussion is really very troubling. If we are really worried that Russia and China are going to exercise soft power by providing vaccinations, that is a horrible position to take. If Russia and China want to fill the void, God bless them. And this issue of competition really worries me. How are we competing with China? Please tell me. We don't compete that way with our European allies. Obviously, in economics and in business, there are ways that we compete. But I think this whole notion of competition has not been defined. And I think that because it has not been defined, the conflictual aspects of the competition now assert to the surface. And I think we're headed for a situation which is going to get worse, not better. And so before the United States launches on this new policy that the Biden administration will put in, I would like to know where and how and why China is something with whom we have to compete, where we have to compete, and why many, many Americans believe China is the #1 threat. They may have good answers to that question, but right now they haven't provided the evidence. And I'm afraid, while this is not fortunately 1914, we are headed to a situation where I think for reasons that are misinformed and misperceived, China and the United States and possibly the West could be headed for a confrontation that I believe is entirely unnecessary and unavoidable if we can decide where it is we want to be and how we get there. And I'm concerned we're not going to be able to do that.
Victor, I think we got about a minute, so let's talk about an area where perhaps we can shift to cooperation. The United States joining the Paris Climate Accords on Friday. This is an area where we've seen in the past the United States and China working together. Do you see some avenues there where there may be cooperation rather than competition?
Absolutely. I congratulate President Biden and his team for rejoining the WHO and rejoining the climate change accord. All these are very, very important for the United States as well as for mankind as a whole. And China will be very happy to cooperate closely with the United States within WHO and within the climate change accord, because we all need to do the right thing to serve our own interests, but also to serve mankind as a whole. So the world is heading in the better direction. I'm very glad for that.
So are you optimistic, briefly, if you can, about the road ahead?
Yes, I think I'm optimistic about China-US relations going forward because I truly believe President Biden has greater brain power and sophistication in dealing with these things. There are lots of differences between China and the United States, of course, but they need to be handled very carefully so that both China and the United States are winners of this, rather than, for example, both China and the United States are losers if competition gets out of control and deteriorate into unchecked rivalry.
Well, let's leave it there with an optimistic view of things. Thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it. That is this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for watching.